Welcome back to our nightly videos. This video, which is the first in our series on totalitarianism, will focus on the rise of Joseph Stalin and his infamous five-year plans. First, we need to define the word totalitarianism, which was coined by historians to describe a new type of government that emerged in the 20th century. This government was more ambitious in its attempt to control every aspect of the lives of its people. Politically, socially, culturally, totalitarian governments attempted complete control over society. Stalin and Hitler are the two men who embody totalitarianism in most people's minds. We'll cover Stalin today, and tomorrow Hitler will be later next week. But before we grapple with Stalin and his legacy, let's go back to Lenin. By the end of the Russian Civil War, Lenin had laid the groundwork for this new totalitarianism. His Red Army had devastated the countryside and cleansed rebellious ethnic minorities, and his secret police, renamed from the Cheka to the NKVD, terrorized the population of Russia. Lenin's first order of business after the Russian Civil War was to somehow rebuild his economy. In 1921, famine struck southern Russia, and peasants revolted across northern Russia, while the workers went on strike in the two major cities. And throughout all of this, the Soviet Navy mutinied. Lenin's response to these crises was the new economic policy, which allowed for a degree of economic freedom. While heavy industry and the railroads remained in the hands of the Communist Party, ordinary people were allowed to farm their own land, create their own small businesses, and buy and sell commodities in the free market. The NEP, as it was called, was a huge success. Peasants stopped revolting and returned to their fields, and Russia experienced a rapid economic recovery. Lenin, however, did not live to see the end of the NEP. He suffered a debilitating stroke in 1922 and died in 1924 without naming a successor to lead the Soviet Union. Two men vied for control in the wake of Lenin's death: Leon Trotsky and Joseph Stalin. Trotsky was the obvious choice to succeed Lenin. He was famous before the Bolsheviks ever seized power, known worldwide as the brilliant speaker and writer who promoted revolution. He was also the man who orchestrated the October Revolution in 1917, and he led the Red Army to victory during the Russian Civil War. But Trotsky was brash, arrogant, and egotistical. He made a lot of enemies within the Communist Party, but perhaps most importantly, Trotsky underestimated the cunning of Joseph Stalin. Stalin, unlike Trotsky, was not a brilliant speaker, nor was he particularly famous. As we mentioned before, he wasn't even Russian. He was from Georgia and made a name for himself during the Civil War by repressing ethnic revolts. After the Civil War, Stalin preferred to work behind the scenes. In 1922, his official title was, quote, Secretary General of the Communist Party, a title he retained for the next 30 years. He was never president nor prime minister. Instead, Lenin gave Stalin this seemingly insignificant secretarial role of appointing local officials to the Communist Party. But Stalin used this position to his advantage, filling the communist ranks with people loyal to him. He also built close alliances with veteran communist leaders who despised Trotsky, men such as Zinoviev, Kamenev, and Kirov, all of whom thought that they could control Stalin once Trotsky was removed from power. By 1927, Trotsky was politically isolated. Stalin and his henchmen removed Trotsky from power and accused him of treason. Instead of standing trial, Trotsky fled before he could be arrested, living 14 years in exile. He ended up in Mexico, where in 1941, one of Stalin's assassins murdered Trotsky with an ice pick. In 1928, Stalin solidified his control over the Soviet Union. He declared an end to the new economic policy and began a new program that had devastating consequences. This program, and there are actually two of them, were called the 5-year plans. The goal of the 5-year plans was to increase the Soviet Union's industrial output by 250% and increase its agricultural output by 150%. It's important to note that Stalin and his allies were inventing the notion of communism as they progressed. Karl Marx did not leave his followers with a playbook about how exactly the dictatorship of the proletariat would look. Stalin, therefore, had to improvise. Before we ask the question of how the 5-year plan worked, we need to ask the why question. Why did Stalin launch the 5-year plan? What was he thinking? First and foremost, Stalin was a committed socialist. One can assume that he genuinely feared that the NEP was restoring capitalism at a grassroots level, destroying the very purpose of the October Revolution. The second reason was nationalistic. Stalin, unlike Trotsky, did not emphasize the notion of spreading the communist revolution to other countries. Stalin's phrase at the time was socialism in one country, and he sometimes referred in public speeches to how he wished to rebuild Russia's greatness in an effort to compete with the other industrialized countries of Europe. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, Stalin used the 5-year plan to consolidate his power domestically or within the Soviet Union. This plan became an all-out war on the peasants, who Stalin would have associated with capitalism. So now for the how question. How did Stalin plan to accomplish these goals? The plan was relatively simple. The Soviet Union produced large amounts of grain, but they lacked heavy industry. So the 5-year plans proposed to nationalize Soviet farmland, confiscate most if not all of the grain, and then trade that grain with foreigners for heavy industry that could produce steel. Much of the labor for building railroads, digging canals, and creating cities were there where there were once just villages. This labor would be provided by political prisoners. The NKVD, therefore, would play a key role in supplying the Soviet Union with what was effectively slave labor. The 5-year plans began with what was called collectivization, or the forcible consolidation of peasant farms into large Soviet-run farming enterprises. Peasants, in other words, were forced to leave their homes, give up their livestock, live in communal housing, and eat in communal kitchens. The harvests that these collective farms produced were then confiscated by the Red Army. The result was effectively a war in the countryside. Stalin ordered the liquidation, quote-unquote, liquidation of the kulaks, or wealthy peasants. In response, peasants slaughtered their sheep, goats, and cattle rather than allow confiscation, resulting in a 50% decrease of the livestock in the Soviet Union. By 1938, 93% of Soviet peasants lived on collective farms, yet at the same time agricultural output failed to increase. But since much of the harvest was exported, peasant families starved. Stalin intentionally used starvation as a tactic to force various ethnicities to accept Soviet rule. This was especially true in the Ukraine, where 6 million people starved during the 5-year plans, most of whom were women and children. Some families even resorted to cannibalism, and I need to warn you, you're about to see a disturbing image of just such an incident. It's difficult to look at, so you may want to revert your gaze for a second. Okay, here we go. Okay, you can look now. Industrial output, unlike agricultural output, did increase. The jump in output was actually quite remarkable. By 1938, the Soviet Union increased their industrial production by 400%. 25 million peasants moved from the countryside to the newly built cities to provide labor in the factories. Foreign engineers from Germany, Britain, and even the United States provided the expertise to run these factories. Here's some workers, a close-up of the foreign engineers. The question we need to ask, and this is a question for historians, was all of this worth it? I think it's immoral to justify the death of millions of people, and I think most historians would agree. And the amount of human suffering caused by the 5-year plans is hard to fathom. It's hard for us to wrap our heads around. More people died as a result of Stalin's ambitions than those who were killed on both sides of World War I. The numbers of dead are over 10 million. Having said all that, in the 1940s, Stalin would mobilize this new industrial output in order to defeat another totalitarian dictator, Adolf Hitler. But that clash of the two totalitarian dictators is a story for next week.